Well, despite numerous challenges both here in the United States and Europe, Google remains at the top of the ladder in terms of the world of search. But a recent paper looks at just how that is occurring. Pleasure to be joined by Leon Musolff, who is an assistant professor of business economics and public policy here at the Wharton School. Leon, great to have you with us today. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much for having me, Dan. Always happy to talk more about this fascinating antitrust case.
It is, and it's obviously an interesting topic, especially when you think about how long Google has had this position in the world of search. Let me start, I guess, with how you go about researching something like this.
So the core idea of our paper is to run what we call a field experiment. So we want to actually observe how people make their choices between search engines in as natural environment as possible. So literally on their computers. For this, we developed a little browser extension that can basically tell us which search engine they are using at any given time. And then we walk them in a survey through various sort of what we call treatments. So, for instance, we might pay some users money to try out a different search engine. But that money, that incentive runs out after 2 weeks. And the question is, once that incentive runs out, if I paid you some money to try Bing, for instance, are you then going to switch back to Google, or are you going to stick with Bing? And as you might imagine, the answer could depend on whether we remind you, hey, you are now not being paid anymore to try a different search engine. So do you want to switch back?
How does then the quality of the experience play in to the decision of which search engine they might use?
Right. So the idea is that choices between search engines could be driven by a couple of different things. So one of them is like the quality of the search engine. But also there might be an aspect where there is a search engine that's just the default in your browser. Indeed, we know that Google pays around $26 billion a year to remain the default on various browsers and devices. So you might think, a lot of people are just going to go with whatever the default search engine is. And then the last thing that could play in is, not the true quality, but sort of a perception of quality that might not necessarily be accurate. If I ask you, have you ever used a search engine that is not Google? The answer might be no, I've never even tried this. And because of that, you might not actually know, what the quality is of the competition.
So you mentioned using Bing in this research. What was the general consensus from the people that you had in this research about Bing? And did they want to stay with Bing, or did they feel more comfortable or just fall back in terms of using Google after the experiment?
Right. So the core group where this is an interesting question is the people that we tried to, that we paid some money to try Bing. But then we reminded them and we said, hey, now that you're making an active choice again, now that we're not paying you money again, do you want to switch back? And what we saw there is that about a third of these users stuck with Bing. And that surprised us because that suggested that, after experiencing both search engines, there was actually a sizable minority that seem to prefer Bing to Google. Now, I want to be careful to say, a third of users is definitely not 100% of users. The vast majority of users still prefer Google, even if they are informed. But it is interesting to know that, about a third of users could be shifted in this way if they just were to experience the other search engine.
But there is that component of people just kind of logging on to probably whatever search engine they are using that is, first up kind of in the rotation on their device, and they stick with it, and they don't really consider whether or not it's Google, Bing, Microsoft, whatever it is.
One other thing that we did as part of this experiment is for some people, we paid them some money to switch the default search engine sort of very briefly, and then we just never reminded them of this fact again. And one thing that was maybe less surprising, but still very interesting, is that these people at very high rates stuck with that changed search engine, even though they had previously been using a different search engine, right? So this default does seem to have an outsized influence on what search engines people choose. But there is an interesting subtlety here because the default for most people is Google because people use Chrome or on their mobile devices in Safari, always Google is the default. But Google is also the search engine they would choose if they were to sort of actively think about it without experiencing a different search engine. You might think that's because Google has a really high brand value or something like that. But that means that just changing what is the default search engine would work, but just having people make an active choice rather than like giving them the default of Google would not work in changing Google's market share.
I know in the terms of this research, you're talking about Google and you use Bing as the example, but it makes me also wonder about something like Microsoft with Edge and whether or not we should expect either already or down the road that Microsoft would be able to gain a certain advantage because of Edge and it going into so many of their devices.
100% agree. And I think that has already happened. So in our study, we explicitly separate out Chrome users and Edge users. And that's actually really useful for us because, like you say, the Edge users have a Bing default. And so that allows us to sort of, get some more sense of how much defaults influence choices. And we do find that Bing has a huge advantage because of Edge. And indeed, I keep referring to Bing and Google as the only two search engines when we all know there is a bunch of other search engines. That's because they jointly have a really, really high market share, on the order of 95%. And that is, we think, exactly because Google has the default on the Chrome browsers and Bing has the default on the Edge browser.
What do you think then that this research could mean for the policy path? Because certainly there is still lots of discussion about the potential of monopoly that Google has in the area of search.
No, I totally agree with you. And indeed, the Judge Mehta is deciding right now what remedies to impose on Google in this antitrust trial after ruling last summer that Google is a monopolist and has sort of violated anti-competitive clauses. And what we think would be most useful is any policy that has sort of two key features. The first feature is that it must respect users' choice. So the dangerous thing about defaults is that users are not making an active choice. They're just sort of just sticking with what they're presented with by the browser. So we need to do away with that. But the interesting additional fact that our research uncovers is that that's not quite enough because users do not know the quality of all the products. So somehow a successful policy needs to expose users to alternative search engines, to at least one more search engine, not just Google. And one way one could accomplish this is by defaulting people into, say, Bing or some other search engine at random. And then after a certain period of time, say 2 weeks, have them make an active choice. So then you would have both of those features where they experience, or at least a bunch of them experience a different search engine because they just stick with the default. But then we also sort of rescue them from that other search engine if they really dislike it. And that second part is really important. Just making some other search engine the default is really bad because we find that users massively prefer Google on average, even if there is some exceptions to that rule.
And probably at this point in time, with how much we use the main search engines out there, it might be hard to expect to see a third company kind of outside of Microsoft or Google being able to gain enough market share where you can have all three of them on a level playing field.
Yeah, so I totally agree with that. One core complication there that we haven't mentioned before is that there might also be what we call feedback effect. So basically, if you have more users, you learn more about what results users like, and so it becomes easier to serve relevant results. And we find in our paper that these effects are not so important for the competition between Bing and Google because they're both already quite sizable. But if you were a small company starting a new search engine, that sort of effect would certainly limit your ability to compete with the big boys. Yeah.
Leon, great to have you with us today and get your insight. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Leon Musolff, who is an assistant professor of business economics and public policy here at the Wharton School.